Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jane Grohl, and I'm the CEO of the DevOps Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined today by David West, who's CEO of Scrum.org, and we're very proud to introduce a new concept called ScrumOps. Dave, hi.
Hi, Jane. I was thinking when you called me David, I was in trouble there, but hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. So I guess I'll get started. It's really, as Jane said, an exciting, idea that was really born from a conversation between myself and Jane at dinner. We were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, a gentleman called Alan Schimmel, who runs DevOps.com. And he has known me for a while and obviously known Jane for a long time. And he got us together to talk about why the Agile community and the DevOps community don't work together more reasonably. And honestly, neither of us had a really good reason for that. So that sort of inspired us to start talking about how we can better align these communities and better build bridges between these communities, because the last thing we want is yet another silver bullet. So as Jane said, my name's Dave West. I'm the CEO and product owner here at Scrum.org, the home of Scrum. But interestingly, though Scrum.org, as in the title you can probably tell, is all about Scrum, when Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum, created this organization, founded this organization, he focused on the profession of software delivery, improving the profession of software delivery. And why that's so important when we talk about ScrumOps is that ultimately DevOps and the Agile community and Scrum have been continuously trying to improve the profession of software delivery. And what's interesting here, the home of Scrum at Scrum.org, we've been doing it very much focused on Scrum teams and teams of teams with Nexus. And as you can see here, these are some of the numbers of slightly out of date, but all numbers charts always do, hey, that there's probably between 12 and 15 million people doing Scrum every day. Now, those people are trying to improve how they deliver value to their clients. You can see the number of professionals, the number of Scrum trainers that we have in our community, and it's a very vibrant and strong community, which is really interesting. And I guess that's the reason why our conversations have been going so well between DevOps Institute and Scrum.org, because ultimately, and I'll let Jane talk about this, but DOI is very similar in terms of focus that Scrum.org is. So Jane, do you want to introduce DevOps Institute?
Sure, Dave. So very proud to introduce the DevOps Institute. We were founded in 2015 with the intent of becoming the global learning community around emerging DevOps practices. As many of you know, DevOps has really crossed the chasm from the early adopters into the enterprise space more quickly, perhaps, than some of the other frameworks that IT applies. And as interest and practices have started to grow, some from a collective body of knowledge, some certainly from real life practices and real life enterprises, we recognize that a growing community was developing, and that the ability to develop training, certification, learning opportunities, and community engagement became very, very important. So over the past couple of years, we've been developing a portfolio of competency-based certifications that really look at what are these not only emerging practices, but what are the emerging competencies that are associated with it, competencies like security and DevOps or testing and DevOps, and what kind of skills does the modern IT professional need in a digital economies.
So what's really interesting is obviously Scrum.org's been around for 8-9 years. Scrum has been around for 2022 this year. So it was very interesting when Jane and I started talking about the relationship between Scrum and DevOps, that DOI was sort of doing very similar things to us, but to a different community. And so let's see if we can align these communities to allow them to play better together, to hopefully start solving some of these challenges as a group rather than separately. And these challenges are real. Let's put some context to the world. Now, these are four things that happened last year that really surprised me. Now, I'm not a betting man, but I learned very long time the only person that makes money out of betting is the bookie. But ultimately, these things surprised me. Donald Trump became president of the United States of America. The United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union with something called Brexit. But even more so, Leicester City, my team, now obviously that has recently changed. Chelsea is now our English Premier League champions with a much higher wage bill, and normality has returned to the world. But 5,000 to 1, Leicester City won the Premier League. And then there's the Cubs, who also were a bit of a long shot to win the World Series. We live in very surprising and, dare I say, turbulent times. Change seems to be the single unit of truth. The only thing we can predict is that we can't predict what's happening. And an author that I particularly like, Thomas Friedman, who's written some very famous books like The World is Flat, talks about this age of accelerations, because of changes around the market. He calls it digital globalization. The fact that when your Verizon or AT&T cell phone has some challenges, you phone somebody and speak to somebody in South America or in India to help you fix those things. Mother Nature is obviously a huge change. I don't know about you, but I'm always surprised, well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised coming from England, that the weather changes so frequently. And how many times do you hear this is the wettest, or this is the driest, or this is the hottest day, or month or year. And then, of course, this massive exponential growth in computing power. Now, obviously, we are reaching some of the physical limits to chips and how fast we can make chips and how much more powerful. But with the rise of the cloud and this network type computing model, we're actually continue to see huge growth. Now, all these things are working together in a chaotic manner, which is really giving rise to things like Agile, because Agile and Scrum 21 years ago, as Scrum was invented or was created or was founded, I don't know, discovered, it depends on your view of the world. And it was founded really in response to the fact that Jeff and Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland were working in increasingly frustrating situations with their customers and realized that there needs to be a different way. And Ken went on almost a quest to find that and created Scrum in response to working in a different way, working in a way that lives in this complex world, a world where we don't know what the requirements are. We don't know what the technology to solve those requirements are until we actually do it. It's funny, when I show this chart, many times do we have people say, oh, I'm in a situation, we can get the customers to agree stuff, and we're using the same technology that we used. And then when you dig a little bit deeper and you start asking about, hey, so you've never had a customer that says, oh, I see that, how about doing this? Or you've never had a situation where you have multiple options for a technology solution and you're always, finding the right thing. Well, actually, no, most situations now, most opportunities, particularly the high value opportunities, definitely operate in this unknown world. So I think we're all very familiar with this inspection and adaptation lifecycle. It's at the heart of Scrum. It's this fundamental approach where you continuously, empirically, look at the problem you're trying to solve. You break it down into small chunks. You decide what those outcomes are that you're seeking. You build some of it, you inspect, and then you adapt. And you continuously spin on this axis, trying to find that solution that you're looking for, trying to get it until, for most cases, your customer is happy. And Scrum really, this lightweight framework really does that. It provides you as a team to actually work in this unknown world. It allows you to rapidly deliver observations and then learn by those. And it provides just enough process to raise transparency, to create that inspection, to allow you to adapt. And it provides you mechanisms through the events, through the artifacts, and through the roles of Scrum. It's funny that 10 minutes to learn, a lifetime to master. Jane and I laugh about this all the time because we've both, not that we're that young, that sounds rude now, but we've both been around for a little while. We've had some experiences, and we both learned Scrum a long time ago. And it's funny that we still find new things whenever we're trying to apply it. So the framework, you can see work defined by a product backlog is planned into a chunk of work called a sprint. Hopefully it's the most valuable stuff that we can deliver. The product owner drives that then works into a small time box called a sprint. That sprint is got to be less than a month, and hopefully tends to be longer than a week. So you meet on a daily basis called the daily scrum to sort of inspect how the team's working. You review at the end of the time box, you review your findings of it with something called a potentially useful increment, and then you retrospect. Now, interestingly, just because the review is at the end of the time box does not mean that you can't deliver throughout. And that's one of the things that we've found over and over again. We talk about DevOps, and something that we're going to talk more about as we talk about this ScrumOps idea, the idea that there's no reason why you can't use this framework to deliver continuously. It's not anathema to the idea of continuous delivery. And ultimately, what we're describing here is the planning cycle, the review cycle, the inspection and adaptation cycle, and the transparency cycle. That does not mean that you can't do things on a much more rapid frequency. So unfortunately, what we've identified and what we've seen in the industry, this is a term that I coined when I was an analyst at Forrester Research, is that increasingly organizations are using Scrum. You saw between 12 and 15 million people using it every day, but it lives in a framework that is not very agile. Water, Scrum, full. Now that's very frustrating, and that frustration really has driven a number of people to start thinking that Scrum is bad. But ultimately, the idea of Scrum, the idea of inspection adaptation, this lightweight framework that helps teams and teams of teams to deliver fabulous software isn't wrong. But you can imagine that working in an environment that looks something like this. Now these are, Prince 2 and the ITIL v3. My gosh, these life cycles, these complex processes that Scrum's trying to live inside. You've got these funding processes at the front of the life cycle. Let's call that water in terms of water Scrum full, where everything has to be dotted and crossed, and everybody is trying to ensure that the minimum risk, maximum return, making sure that there's lots and lots of accountability, responsibility being driven. And then that goes into the Scrum team to actually deliver working software. And then you've got the ITIL kind of service management lifecycle, which lives on top again. So you can imagine that the Scrum team is being asked to deliver all sorts of things, again, to try to reduce risk. So it's kind of challenging to deliver Scrum in these environments, and that's one thing that I think has driven us to think about other approaches, or maybe hopefully you're going to hear today, supporting approaches like DevOps. So Jane, isn't DevOps the answer then?
DevOps saves the world, right, Dave?
That's what I'm looking for.
So, one of the challenges with an amazing framework like Scrum is that while the sprints were time boxed to be less than a month and an iterative and incremental approach was taken, often downstream there were delays. So the flow of work coming out of a sprint into the delivery of software into production had to go through several other passes before it actually entered into production. So as DevOps started to emerge as something that was introduced, again, way back in 2008, literally in a couple of discussions, hashtags, and presentations about an agile infrastructure and the introduction of the first DevOps days in Ghent, Belgium, there was a recognition that when we started to look at the output of Scrum teams, the downstream activities were still not as agile as they should be. And frankly, they weren't as automated as they should be as well. And so emerged this concept of DevOps and really starting to look at the problem of how do we engage the processes and practices of dev with the processes and practices of ops so that we can actually start to deliver software in a much cleaner flow, a much faster flow, and a much more automated flow.
And I think it's ironic that when we look at this, Jane, that they started in Benelux, and that's the strongest place that Scrum is in the world. In fact, Scrum's taught in schools in the Netherlands, which is crazy. And really that it very much focused on trying to do that last mile, that last get the software into the hands of customers. So imagine being able to apply agile development to release management infrastructure, taking the practices of CI that was obviously created by Martin Fowler, one of the signatories of the DevOps of the Agile Manifesto, and trying to really see what that meant for an operations and release organization. And then Jez, one of the disciples of Martin, Jez Humble, who worked together with Martin at ThoughtWorks, led to this continuous delivery model, which I think is really, really, really interesting. So very much focused on the solving the water Scrum fall.
Agreed. And, one of the other interesting aspects of that, Dave, is this concept of release management. So I come from the ITSM space. And as you said, some of the processes were really built around waterfall. If you think about ITIL, the last update was 2011. The major update was in 2007, where waterfall was still a very prominent approach to software development. But the most misunderstood process in all of ITIL was release management. Was it a child of change? Was it the same as change? How did all of that work? And so now we start to look at agile practices going downstream into a release process, and suddenly release management takes the spotlight. It takes the spotlight in terms of what are the downstream activities, how do we increase the flow, how do we expedite the delivery, and how do we maintain quality. So it is really the coming together of many, many practices that IT has been applying over a course of years, but they just haven't been doing it together. So yeah. If we look at kind of, how DevOps is growing up in the wild, and there are many interpretations of a definitive definition of DevOps. The most commonly used definition is one that's been growing. And I say that with all due respect to all the contributors. It literally has been growing through Wikipedia into a definition that talks about it being a cultural and professional movement, certainly stressing communication, collaboration, integration, all the things that Dave and I are talking about here. Really looking at software developers and operations. And then there is a key aspect of automation. You mentioned Jez before. One of my favorite quotes from the continuous delivery book is, let's let the machines do all the redundant, boring tasks. Let's let releases be boring and save people for the unique capabilities they have for problem solving and innovation.
But isn't it so much, it's sort of like become a little bit more than that though, hasn't it, Jane? I mean, this is one of the slides that you have in one of your courses, and I think it really does sort of highlight the fact that it's sort of growing, hopefully, and we'll talk more about agile at the center, but when I first saw this slide, I thought this looked very, very agile.
Well, it's intended to be end-to-end organizational agility so that we can extend agility beyond the software development lifecycle, right? So that we can actually start to look at the entire spectrum of IT and introduce concepts like lean and measurement and sharing, things that, as IT has grown up, we're a pretty young industry. And we love our frameworks. I mean, Dave and I, you and I have had extensive conversations about that, we're very loyal to our frameworks. And so if you start to look at the values, this is the extension of Agile, what it means to be Agile, right, as opposed to do Agile, all across the entire IT spectrum.
Yeah, and I just think it was interesting because sometimes people often rail against automation in the Agile community because, it's one of the key tenets of the Agile Manifesto is again tools. And it's just ironic that the only way you can scale, as Jez highlighted with the make computers do the things that they're really good at, is that you do need automation. You do need to build on top of that, and measurement, and you have to accept that organizations are cultural machines, so, which is, I think, sort of interesting. But I think this is probably more telling than what it is, really, the side that you would talk about what it isn't.
Yeah, so again, a lot of interpretations about DevOps, and I think there's a little frustration that there isn't a single body of knowledge that an organization can turn to chapter and verse to determine how to do DevOps. But on the other hand, it's growing up very much in a collective sense. As I said in the very beginning, DOI is a learning community. We have 75 partners after 2 years in 25 countries. So there is a lot of that cross collaboration occurring. But DevOps is not a title, right? This concept of a DevOps engineer is a little bit of a mythical creature. Patrick Dubois, known as the godfather of DevOps, once defined for me a DevOps engineer as a systems engineer with a good attitude, right? So it's not a title, it's not a specific team, it's not a specific tool. It's not only about culture, it's certainly not only about automation, and it is certainly not no ops. You might have heard that term being floated around with the intent of serverless environments, but no ops does not mean no job, right? We like to use the term new ops instead. And it is definitely not a replacement for agile or IT service management or lean. I like to think of it as the crossroads.
Yeah, I think this really, and I know that when having a conversation at dinner that all those months ago, almost a year ago now, it was very clear that these like what it isn't was really reassuring for somebody that comes from a community that feels a little bit under pressure with the DevOps community, because it's sort of wanting to be this all everything. So I thought that was really, and the fact that it's all about this end-to-end flow about waste, which ultimately, from an agile team point of view, we see that organizations are inherently say sort of inhibitors for agility at the team level, and that's where it has to happen. So oh dear, that's sorry about that. What's interesting is that what's driving it. So Jane, maybe we'll talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I loved in the beginning, Dave, when you were talking about software delivery, right? And every business, regardless of your vertical market today, is a software delivery business, and that's become clearer and clearer. I was at a conference last week, and one of the presenters was talking about Walmart and how Walmart now considers itself to be a technology organization, and regardless of whether you're a small organization or a large organization, it is really fascinating that the digital transformation has really kind of driven how organizations are performing. I mean, look at the disruption. I think you alluded to that with could you predict events like Brexit or Trump becoming president or those sports teams? But more importantly, could you predict things like Uber or Airbnb and disruptive technology that traditional enterprises are really competing against? We have to continuously deliver value all the time, every day. And the best way to do that is to bridge and integrate every aspect of IT, right? It is no longer okay for us to be loyalists. Our challenge is we have to go faster. We can't risk quality. And even though we've done some very, very good improvement initiatives like Agile or IT service management or purchasing automation, none of those on its own has saved the world or delivered the end-to-end value. Your biggest competitor is likely going to be a disruptor, and it's likely going to be a disruptor who you have no idea today even exists. So you're going to be blindsided by some type of a disruptor. And unfortunately, the biggest constraint is IT silo culture, whether it's siloed by subject matter expertise, it's siloed by HR organizations, or it's just siloed by loyalty to automation or frameworks.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that as a large organization, you have all the assets in the world. You have money, you have people, you have experience, you have data, lots and lots of data usually. But that's actually an inhibitor for agility, and the companies you're going to be competing with in the 21st century don't have those incumbent sort of systems legacy processes and silos, so they can be a lot more fast to market now. Whether they can scale is a whole different question. So I think that, you know, that the world isn't as perhaps as easy as it should be, and DevOps is also having some challenges. I think this, obviously a Game of Thrones fan myself. So Jane, what do you see the biggest challenges for DevOps?
So, so if you sort of look at this, and yes, it's a parody on Game of Thrones, but I also think it speaks to kind of where IT is today, right? We definitely have territorial kingdoms, and we have loyalists in each of those kingdoms. So if you're a Scrum Master like Dave is and I am, if you're a lean proponent, if automation is your thing, right, your go-to solution is to buy something, or security folks, and then of course you cross the sunset sea into the service management space. We've done a lot of great things in IT over the course of the last 40 or 50 years to improve, right? We started out by replicating business process, then we moved to web services, and now we really are at a crossroads. If we don't bring these territories together and stop trying to compete to sit on the Iron Throne, for those of you with Game of Thrones references, then we will not be able to meet the requirements, and the disruptors that are waiting at the gate are going to be able to overtake and not necessarily integrate with existing society.
Yeah, I think the disconnect between the communities, between the, you know, they're sort of reinforcing all the things that we say you shouldn't have in your organization. So, you know, just to use an English analogy, we're all doomed. It does feel like that some days. As I'm trying to get Elastic Beanstalk to work with AWS with Drupal in the back end recently, from my own experience, I'm like, why is this so hard, and why can nobody talk about it consistently? But you know, maybe it can be a little depressing some days. But I sort of step back and look at the history of the agile world, the history of innovation, and you know, that ultimately I think that I think we can learn something from what's happened before of us. And this is a paper written by the two gentlemen that were working on lean at Harvard Business School, and obviously they categorized the way Toyota was working the Toyota way as this lean approach, and fundamentally it then drove out this different way of thinking about organizations. And these are the 6 things that they identify in this paper, the new product game. I recommend everybody should read it. And what's cool about this is, you know, that it's self-organization, you know, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It's goal-oriented. They deliver small chunks of working functionality and observed behavior, so it's empirical. They're very much learn by doing rather than planning kind of teams. Simple. Everything's very simple and transparent, and they have a culture which is this osmosis sort of culture. The teams stay together and they learn together, and it comes back to this loop that we saw earlier, that at the heart of both DevOps and Scrum is this concept of inspection and adaptation through transparency. But fundamentally, this approach is undermined consistently, and this is a bit of an eye chart, but by the big world, you know, by the scaling inside an organization. I know that I can build, and Jane and I talk about this quite a lot, that we can build small teams and we can enable them with the best practices of DevOps, the best practices of Scrum, and they can deliver fabulous software for customers. I think, you know, that they might get it wrong, and that's great. They might deliver the wrong thing and learn by it and continuously be changing. They might highlight some of their own challenges, but we know that website refreshes and innovation projects and emergency projects, those classical, like, oh my God, the world's on fire, let's fix it. You know, the fact that the Obamacare website, it was a nightmare, but it got fixed relatively quickly, right? With a very small team, actually, much smaller than the people that built it originally. I don't know if you've read the case studies about that, but ultimately we know that you can build great software and deliver great value to your customers. I think Uber proves it every day. I think Tesla proves it every day, and we know we can do that. But inside your own organizations, you know, the scaling of those is kind of spotty. Spotify, Google, Intuit, you know, maybe some of these companies, but ultimately that even those companies, and as an analyst I spent time talking to those organizations, wrestling with it. Now we did find, and this is some research that I did when I was an analyst, we found though that ultimately there is one way of fixing it, and I think that we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about ScrumOps. But think about the challenges, around legacy systems, around the culture of silos, independent verification, validation, separate, this risk averse finance, trying to ensure that money is being spent very wisely, the market in terms of short-term pressures and lack of understanding by the owners. These challenges can get in the way. The one thing though that we've universally seen, and the one sort of the fundamental sort of foundation to everything, is this concept of people. I can't tell you the perfect process. I can't tell you the best discipline, the best practices to adopt from DevOps, from the DevOps sort of catalog of practices around automation and around, cultural change. I can't tell you how to build the perfect process. What I can tell you is that if you empower and enable and provide your teams, if you create an environment where those teams and those individuals work incredibly successfully and are in an environment built for success, whether it be craftsmanship or professionalism, that we can solve all those problems. And I think this is a quote and a law that Jane likes to talk about, and she introduced me to this, and I think it really just sums it up. It's funny that if you build great people and allow them to work how they need to work to get the job done, then you will build organizations and structures that can actually deliver the value. But ultimately, the only people that know the right communication structures, the only people that know who to talk to, isn't some magical management. It isn't some magical systems process or life cycle. It is about the people. So ultimately, everything that we are going to talk about when we talk about ScrumOps is about providing a framework that allows these people to effectively deliver value and are freed from the constraints that are imposed on them from a traditional organization. This is your favorite law, Jane. Have I horribly destroyed this, or is anything you want to add around this?
No, not at all. I think when we get to the core of Conway's law and why it has really risen in DevOps, if you read a lot about DevOps practices, you attend a lot of DevOps presentations, Conway's law is very frequently referenced. And if you really kind of look at the core concept, it's our systems are going to be replicas of our communication structures. Right. So the success of our system is also going to be based on the success of our communication structure. So if we're not talking to each other, we're not collaborating with each other, then our systems are going to only have a limited amount of success. If we can increase that communication in DevOps, Gene Kim's Phoenix project, the second way is to shorten your feedback loops, right? So the ability for us to be able to engage internally, right, as part of our own system, and to increase that communication will also increase the flow, the value, and the success of the end-to-end IT system as well. So it's kind of a cool concept. What's really interesting is it's not a particularly modern concept. It was actually developed quite a long time ago.
Yeah, and I think it's funny how organizations sort of ignore this premise and define systems and processes that are an anathema to the teams that are trying to get the work done. And so then the teams have to build up all these informal processes and systems and communication models to respond to the environment if they want to be successful, or they just give up and it ends up being a very inefficient process. So I guess Conway's law and the ideas of Scrum and the ideas of, we've talked a lot about, the DevOps can fix some of the problems, and yes, it can, particularly in Water Scrum Fall. We talked a little about that. We talked a little bit about Conway's laws, but ultimately it all begins with the team. And so building that competency up at the team level and being able to concentrate and enable that team. Now, so what we're talking about is really ScrumOps is still doesn't discard this in favor of automation or in anything else. It's about building out from these self-organized teams. They have all the skills necessary to deliver the work. It's small, plus or minus 2, 7 plus or minus 2, or 6 plus or minus 3, or whatever you want to call it. It's safe, meaning that they have an environment which makes them able to do the experiments, deliver the value, and learn, even if sometimes they get things wrong. Focuses on the outcomes, particularly customer success outcomes, and actually has everything it needs to get stuff done. But there's an interesting, it highlights the first problem that DevOps is sort of wrestling with as well, that, you know, hasn't all the skills necessarily to deliver the work. You know, what does that really mean? You know, front end, back end, mobile, security, performance, operations, infrastructure, release management, UX. And, you know, when Jane and I delivered this keynote the first time in, or this presentation the first time as a keynote, to DevOps Connect in Dallas, there was a couple of people were very interesting in the audience. They were like, well, yeah, but I can't, you say it's got to be 7 ± 2, right? But to have all the people necessary to deliver working software in our organization would be about 30 people. How do you manage this? And that's one of the first challenges of building these cross-functional teams that can deliver working software. It's making the decisions around either having external dependencies on organizational constructs now, you know, like, you know, operations and support and performance testing and security, or bringing those competencies into the team. And there's no easy way of solving this, which is obviously very, very challenging. So if we look a little bit on how the best teams are how they start approaching this, you allow the teams to self-organize, you allow them to opt in for the things that make sense, you basically give them an environment that supports autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which brings us to this, that mastery one really brings us to the sort of heart of the skills issue that really, that ScrumOps, to use a cum phrase, is really focused on. It's about trying to build a series of competencies that allow people to become these comb-shaped inside these agile teams. So that means that a lot of the dependencies that traditionally have been undermining Scrum teams, which has sort of led us to sort of reevaluate this whole change around flow and around communication, you know, in terms of Conway's laws. What we have to start thinking about is how we can empower and enable these teams to deliver great working software and deliver value to their customers. So the sort of the need to move to comb-shaped people, where some of these specialisms are like performance and operations, and we'll talk more about the sort of mix of what competencies we're looking for in a moment. But then, so you build these cross-functional teams, you enable them to develop into these comb-shaped people, which is a weird thing to say, but you enable them to become both a generalist across a broad set of skills and a specialist in a smaller subset of skills. And then you support them with some shared services. Now, those shared services might be infrastructure, supplier management, automation, could be HR, could be architecture, could be user experience. But you have to decide which ones will be inside your team and which ones will be out. And every situation depends. You know, some situations the infrastructure is incredibly complex and the skills are so specialized that the best way is to actually have that as a shared service that then the team works with to deliver their stuff. In other situations, you may decide that they can move that into the team, and that traditional infrastructure is now becomes some sort of support organization in terms of a community of practice, which I'll talk about in a second. Supplier management, the same. You know, automation, you may decide to have a specialist group that helps do automation that the team then looks to. But remember that every time you have a queue, every time you're dependent on some sort of set of external skills that is outside the team, you potentially could be removing the ability for that team to respond to the environment and be as agile as it needs to be. It's a series of constraints.
And Dave,
now, oh, sorry.
I was going to jump in and just share something because I think that's kind of interesting. So having spent now a lot of time around operational teams and this concept of embed an operational person into your Scrum team, which, you know, theoretically is a great plan, right? Put operational people in your team and expand beyond that. But one of the kind of statistics that's risen out of my conversations is if you look at the ratio of developers to operations individuals, it is a very skewed ratio where there's a lot more developers than there are operational teams. And the practicality of putting an operations person on every single Scrum team, particularly when we're looking at two pizza teams, so they're pretty small, is definitely a challenge. And so what some organizations have done is instead of just even creating that perimeter, is they've created coaching roles where you may have a site reliability engineer that's a coach to, 4 different teams in terms of infrastructure and post-production activities. You may have agile coaches, lean coaches, DevOps coaches that really nurture or immerse the team, but don't actually become a one-on-one relationship with the team so that they can balance that ratio with skills, but not necessarily with headcount.
And I think that's really, really interesting. And it brings us nicely into the sort of like this example, which is this sort of Spotify model where you start having the concept of chapters, small families of people inside a tribe with similar skills, these idea of chapters and guilds. So you start building out sort of, I guess this obviously Spotify used some really trendy terms, chapters, guilds, tribes, squads, which is really, really cool. They could be Scrum teams, they could be nexuses, they could be communities of practice, or local communities of practice, which is what I'm more idea of having a competency framework and a series of communities of practice that help drive those competencies. And maybe over time, you end up rewarding people, I would hope, for the coaching role inside those competencies. It's funny. So as we go into the 21st century and as we try to build more agile organizations, one thing that we've learned is that dictatorial leadership is not necessarily the most sought after skill. Instead, what we're seeing is coaching is a bit more like a martial arts kind of sensei coach kind of model, becomes more the appropriate set of skills. So we need to reward people and build an organization construct that allows those people through those communities to grow. Is it, Jane? We've been, there's some of these models have been talked about a lot. This is the Software Craftsman model, which I just happen to be familiar with. But it's a model around learning. It's a model around community. It formalizes the role of community of practice and maybe some internal type open source sets around. Imagine if you ran your automation frameworks like an internal open source project. Imagine if you use that as a model, everybody can take it and use it, but they have to contribute back to it. But this is just one example, and I don't want to get too tied up with the craftsman metaphors and analogies, because they're very relevant, but they also start breaking down because craftsmen are very good at their crafts. What we're looking for is probably people that are almost professional. So it's not just the craft, the techniques that they use, it's also the values that they live to as well. But it is an interesting model. So what are the areas or the competency areas? What communities of practice or do you reckon we're gonna or chapters or we're gonna need? So these are the 5 that we're very focused on at the moment that are, and yes, there could be testing, and I'll come to that in a second. Maybe that's another one, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But we've got the sort of development competency, and obviously there's a lot of practice. We might probably split that into different parts of development, different technologies, front, back, I don't know. Frankly though, developing working software is crucial. Then we've got continuous delivery. Jane talked a little bit about Jez's book and I mentioned it earlier, but set of competencies and a lot of skills around that. Product ownership, very important if you're building products, that you have some competencies in that community. You have to be able to deliver the right thing for your business, lean startup, design thinking, all of that in that stuff. security. Every day we hear of another threat that's destroying our stuff, but ultimately we need a security community inside your own organization, not a separate department, but some, community that's driving that. And then operations. Jane talked about this sort of misnomer of this problem that we have, where you've got so many developers and not enough ops people, and you need one in every team. So instead of that, these people have to learn to coach, as Jane said. So we start building out a community around operations and, virtual infrastructure, infrastructure as code, all of that kind of stuff. And maybe testing could be a community as well. I don't know. I see it as a competency in all of these areas, whether it be security testing, operational testing, performance and reliability, or whether it be development testing, unit testing as it historically was then, or integration testing, or for continuous integration and continuous delivery. I don't know. Jane, what do you think about these communities?
So obviously the theme here is that the communities are continuous, right? So we do need to have continuous development and continuous delivery and continuous product ownership and continuous security and continuous operation, and certainly continuous testing is a key part of it. But testing is pervasive in each of these. And so one of the shift left approaches of DevOps is that testing starts with the first line of code. So we start to look at test-driven development, and we start to look at testing from an automation perspective, and using, automation as a testing competency, and certainly security as code, security testing as code. Something known as DevSecOps is starting to rise as an emerging practice. And then even testing in production, which is, scary to many, but certainly an approach that if you start to look at testing, test plans and test capabilities, is not so far away from a practical approach. So testing is everywhere. And in reality, Dave, everyone today has to acquire testing skills, right? Whether you're a developer, QA. What we're trying to avoid with this model is having each of these become another siloed community or another, territory in the seven kingdoms. So if we start to build our bridges by using testing or other competencies and really look to that cone-shaped model where there are specialties and broad-based knowledge as well, each of these communities graft to each other instead of repelling from each other and kind of replicating the problem that we're trying to solve.
Exactly. I think so. But then what about this automation, and the processes and automation and the complexity in there? So interestingly, and I think that, that this automation has to sit around it. So in the same way as Jane, you just said around testing, I think that automation, which is sort of the next thing around testing, is to take the drudgery out, making sure it happens. Automation sort of is a set of glue that sort of fits that together. And I'm excited that the automation sort of fits in and fits in with this broad story with respect to the three ways. You sort of see that automation brings in terms of getting that feedback more rapidly, getting those mechanisms in place. And I think this slide might be slightly out of place actually, because that's what I was saying. Use quick automation to enable quicker releases, use model-driven development to ensure consistent releases. Basically get that automation in the right place. And then there's the work you've been doing with the DevOps Express, which I'm really excited about. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for a moment?
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the kind of funny parts of the evolution of IT, and I say funny not in a ha-ha, but in a slightly ironic way, is the world is going digital, and IT has the need to also become digital as well. And so part of what we need to do in our own transformation is to embrace technology as much as we've encouraged our customers to embrace and leverage technology as well. So there is a little bit of an irony there. The DevOps Express, I think, is particularly fascinating because 14 of the most prominent of the tool providers, and there are many, many other tool providers out there, but these are the thought leaders in the IT automation space, have really come together in this initiative known as DevOps Express, with the intent of creating some solid best practices around DevOps automation, really looking at definitive concepts, and even in terms of definitions, some reference architectures, really how to help organizations get started. Each organization, of course, will model based on the needs of their customers and the needs of their business, but really being able to come together to unify, just like Scrum.org and DOI are unifying. It is an industry-wide effort and a recognition that at this point in time, through this transformation, we all need to transform as well. So there's webinars that are occurring, there's best practices, there's taxonomies that are going to come out of DevOps Express. And again, this is just a short list of those that are involved in DevOps Express, but certainly impressed by the intent of this group. And DOI, very fortunately, was invited to be one of the founding members so that we can help capture those best practices and embed that in ongoing learning.
Yeah, so I think it's really, if you think about the competencies surrounding that in terms of automation, this is a great organization and organizational construct or an industry construct that allows those people that are the tool vendors to then start optimizing for those competencies, which I'm really, really excited about. But unfortunately, all this is great without, though, getting the measures in place. How do you know you've won? And there's, sort of like the last element of this story, this ScrumOps kind of story. It all starts with a team. It then goes out into the competencies, the communities of practice, the sort of the idea of the craftsman, building that out. Then surrounding that is automation. We have to think a little bit about. We have to think obviously about making sure that we put measurement frameworks in place that can actually help make sure that we're doing the right things. And this is a set of content that you've been talk a little bit about. So Jane, do you want to talk a little bit about these types of measures?
Sure. So, one of the values of DevOps in what we call the COMS model, culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing, is measurement. And so, IT uses MTTR as one of its primary measures, which is mean time to repair. Some call it mean time to restore. And so in order for MTTR to be efficient, something has to break. And so as we start to look at, how does IT measure, right? How do we measure our success? It has to be multidimensional, right? It has to be multi-layered so that we not only just look at what do we do when things break, or time to deploy, or release frequencies, or things like that. Really have to look at cultural measurements, or process measurements, or quality measurements, right? Certainly the impact on the business, and how much revenue were we able to increase? What kind of throughput were we able to have? So some are measurements that are internal to our own performance. Some are measurements that are internal to our own culture. Some are measurements that are external to our ability to successfully and positively impact our business. So if you start to look at metrics that matter, it really goes beyond the data that we pull out of our monitoring tools that tell us that we're 99.99% up, and that our MTTR is at a certain place, and our release frequency is improving, but that's not necessarily a catch-all measurement. And so the message here, and this comes from a source from Andy Mann of Splunk, is really, again, whatever it works for your organization, these are the high-level categories of metrics that you and your organization really need to address in order to effectively determine how your IT organization is performing. And some of it may even be supplier related as well.
Yeah, so we would, at Scrum.org, we have something called EBM, which is very similar to that, though a little bit more focused on really external or value type measures, like current value, revenue per employee, product cost ratio, employee satisfaction, time to market, so release stabilization, release frequency, cycle time, and then ability to innovate. That's sort of like, are we walking through molasses? Have we got everybody on the same version? Is people using what sort of level of functionality and complexity is actually being used, etc. So, but getting measures in place is the last thing on this sort of broader sort of ScrumOps story. You've got this idea that you've got, continuous measurement, continuous automation around the edges of these competencies of delivery ownership, continuous product ownership, continuous delivery, continuous security, continuous operations. And then the heart of that really is these agile cross-functional teams that are being supported. So we're sort of turning the organization on its head to effectively really enable these teams who are directly connected, hopefully with customers and outcomes, to deliver value. Another way of thinking about this is thinking about building out these competencies, bringing your Scrum teams, adding these competencies, adding some automation, adding some measurement, and then maybe you've got ScrumOps afterwards. And the sort of final slide I sort of want to leave you with, and I'm sure, Jane, you've got some last words of wisdom, is ultimately what we've been talking about today is we've been talking about that it isn't Scrum or DevOps. It's about delivering really an environment that allows agile teams to deliver value to their customers, and to do that in a professional way, which requires them to sort of build out these craftsman type competencies in these areas built on this fundamental premise of sort of agility or professionalism, and then surround that with the appropriate level of automation. And DevOps Express might provide some starters for 10, which is really exciting, and ensure that we're trying to build software that delivers the most value to our customers. That's the journey, and I guess that we're all trying to embark upon and drive ultimately agility into our IT organizations. Jane, do you want to have any summing up?
Sure. So, one of the great things, and I think one of the challenges that have risen out of the Agile movement, is that the belief of agility was relegated specifically to software development. So we're doing Agile. And, Dave, I love the fact that Scrum.org calls it the home of Scrum, right? Because Scrum is a fantastic framework, right? Small set of rules, simple guide, lifetime to master. And then we start to look at DevOps, right? No single body of knowledge, emerging in the wild, and really starting to get organizations, despite all of that, to engage in dialogue in terms of what does it mean to us? How does it help solve some of our challenges? How does it help us deliver value better? And at the end of the day, the word agile, right, even though we use it in a software development context, is really intended to be agile IT. And I know that term has been coined before, right? Is that's what we're trying to achieve. Scrum is a framework. ITSM is a framework, continuous delivery as an approach, DevOps is almost a super framework. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve is end-to-end IT agility. And so that the word agile will become synonymous with IT. I think where the journey is leading us, and Dave, you and I have talked about this, and I think this is a little bit of a precursor to things to come, is that IT, we love our frameworks, but it's time for these frameworks to come together. And I'm really proud of the fact that Scrum.org and DevOps Institute have started that movement, where our frameworks really need to now unify and present themselves ultimately as generally accepted IT principles, right? If you come from an accounting background, accountants have generally accepted accounting principles. Every organization applies those. Those are regulated, whereas IT may not be regulated. But command and control moving into more of an agile approach just means that we need to take all of these amazing practices and really coalesce them into something that says a high-performing IT organization is an agile organization. And not just because they do sprints or have backlogs or have, Scrum Masters. It's because they have competent teams. They're very comfortable with measurement. They're very comfortable with automation. And at the end of the day, they understand what the meaning of deliver value is. And that's what we're hoping to achieve together. I'm proud to do it with you, Dave.
I'm very proud to work with you as well, Jane, and hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, we've made a little bit of sense during this this hour long. I know we haven't, it's kind of taken us right to the end of our time, I'm afraid, but hopefully you've enjoyed this. Help maybe join us on this journey and help us to improve the profession and to really focus on some of these competencies. But thanks ever so for your time, and I look forward to talking to you all soon. Bye, Jane. Thanks for your time.
Bye, Dave. Bye, everyone.